Dear students, now we will move on to the subject of our course, the environmental policy. We will use often the analytical categories and concepts that we just discussed previously. And the first step to meet environmental policy is to focus on characteristics of this kind of policy, that it's a policy of a new generation. We should first of all focus on the features that give singularity to environmental policy. 15 aspects, and in our class of today we will start analyzing these aspects in part 1, and in our 4th class we will conclude this subject, okay? So let's begin with the 15 features. The first of them is the fact that the object of environmental policy is the defense of public goods. The role of environmental policy is to respond to demands for the protection of a kind of so-called public goods. Environmental policy should define the concrete forms of protection, access, provision, and exercise of their rights of use, enjoyment, alienation, exclusion, and conditions for management and governance. This implies institutional changes that will contend with vested interests, which, until recently, could appropriate such environmental goods and services, and this makes the environmental arena a conflict-prone area, because you have many actors in their objectives. The holders of rights to the environment and rights referred to environmental quality, they are collective subjects, indeterminate, as we commented in our first class, the 3rd generation of rights, remember? So this corresponds to this new generation of collective rights subjects and recent objects of regulation, including human rights, the rights of future generation, animal rights, and even nature rights. Examples of nature rights. Ecuador was the first country in the world to accord legal rights to nature. In the country's constitution, in the chapter 7, Ecuador recognizes the rights of Pachamama, that means Mother Earth, to maintain and generate its cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. The right was established after a high court case in the country ruled that mining in a protected region of the Equatorian rainforest violated the rights of nature. In India also, a high court in Chennai, the capital of the southern state of Tamil Nadu, took the stance that nature is a person that needs protection, has joined forces with other nations to enact an ecocentric law to protect nature. In February 2022, the country published a new law whereby it's recognized the right of nature to exist, persist, and regenerate. Or, with all those new approaches, it's very difficult and sometimes it's impossible to identify and give political representation to the beneficiaries of environmental policy. And this is particularly complex if we think of future generations and non-human species. It's very difficult also to assign costs and benefits. We talked today about the financial dimension of policies. No? We have to assign costs and benefits to actors regarding damages and betterments in the environmental quality. And as it is difficult for certain types of beneficiaries to be represented, there is already an intense polemic about the good way to manage and protect these goods. The second feature is the scope of the environmental policy agenda. Since its inception, the environmental agenda has been continually broadened. Until recently, it was common understanding that the environmental agenda would only involve the conservation, protection, and preservation of natural resources, such as public lands and waters, natural areas and fauna, including issues of leisure and aesthetic values. But from the 60s of the past century onwards, this agenda was broadened to also refer to the protection against air, water, and soil pollution and degradation based on a concern for human health. And in the 70s, the agenda of several countries began to include also the control of industry and activities that impact and not only pollute natural resources, including energy production and consumption patterns. Today, some decades after, environmental policy has an agenda broader than ever. It encompasses, often more implicitly than explicitly, government actions related to health and safety, energy use, transportation, urbanization, agricultural and food production, population growth, and the protection of ecological, geochemical, and geophysical systems, production and consumption patterns from the perspective of sustainability and in its multiple connections between local, national, and global issues. We have all the huge planet global problems, global warming, the protection of biodiversity, the struggle against desertification, mountains, and so on. It is very important to identify the broadness of this agenda because this makes the state very powerful, because the environmental and the sustainability agendas, they interfere in almost every realm of the private and of our collective life. The third feature is the amount of actors. Environmental defense involves many actors, creating numerous arenas for each issue of this broad environmental agenda. In each of these topics of the environmental agenda, there are civil associations, private companies, local representations, companies and trade unions, organizations from the global governance regime, transnational civil organizations, as well as local, regional, and national civil organizations, and local, regional, and central governments. In Brazil, for instance, we also have the institutional representatives of the diffuse interests. Remember the diffuse interests? In the case of Brazil, the institutional representative is the Public Prosecutor's Office. And in each of these arenas, these actors are confronted with different interests. So I may participate in one arena and I will be on your side, in your advocacy coalition, for instance. We will defend the same goals regarding a river basin that we want to protect, but I may have an opinion different from you in another arena regarding, for instance, the deforestation of the Amazonian region. In the policy cycle, the actors are different according to each stage, to each phase of the policy cycle. So there are some actors that interfere in the definition of the government agenda. There are other actors that are only interested in the implementation phase, for instance. There are also other actors that have an important participation in the transformation in one social problem in a public problem. Another aspect important to stress, to highlight, is that as we have so many actors, it is essential to avoid conflictual approaches. Agreed and democratic solutions are essential. In their absence, conflicts and different interpretations of regulations lead to disputes being transferred to the judicial sphere, paralyzing the decision-making process. In this process that we call judicialization of the public policy. Anthony Downs emphasizes also the importance of the participation and the need to mobilize the public opinion to maintain environmental programs and the government agenda during the periods of dispersed attention and loss of public interests. Stakeholders should be enabled to defend their interests throughout the policy cycle. The fourth characteristic of environmental policy is constituted by the complex patterns of impact and causation. Environmental issues go across different spatial scales because of their distinct impact patterns and geographic spatial causality. Therefore, many strategies require government action at different levels, simultaneously and in concert, necessarily implying cooperative intergovernmental action. A certain kind of impact can be only treated by local government, and others only can be treated by the central government. Also, processes such as the provision of environmental services, about which we talked a little bit in the last class, occur over a wide range of spatial and temporal scales, and thus requires different policy action at different scales. In the spatial dimension, there is also a demand to harmonize national regulations with global regulations. As a country signs a global agreement, he has to internalize this agreement in national regulations. And the subnational levels, they ought to internalize these rules also. As a result, the nature of the policy objects reaffirms the need of joint action by the various levels of government and the existence of a certain interdependence between them. The same occurs to the temporal scale. Government decision-making encompasses short-term decisions, for which consensus building is particularly challenging, and long-term decisions. Advocating for long-term interests is very difficult in the political and parliamentary realms of environmental processes. Political action is ruled by short-term logic, and the environment is ruled by long-term processes. So, our strategies need to ensure continuity of political action through successive electoral processes. The defense of long-term interests is difficult, but it has to be faced. The fifth characteristic is multi-scale and decision-making. The distribution of responsibilities between the spheres of government for a given environmental problem, it's not simple. It is often problematic, leading to gaps and overlaps and tensions. This challenge has been the subject of debate for decades, delineating this tension between centralized and decentralized action. And this is crucial for environmental policy. So important that we will dedicate one class to discuss more from a conceptual and historical point of view this tension between centralization and decentralization. A large part of the environmental movement has positioned itself in favor of decentralized action for ideological reasons, in line with the so-called eco-localist model, and also for political reasons, because they esteem that local solutions will lend themselves more to a bottom-up participatory political approach. Despite the strength of these arguments put forward by the advocates of local environmental action, the exclusive adoption of local initiatives is inconsistent. It's clearly inconsistent as well at the theoretical level as at the empirical level. The emergence of global environmental challenges is one of the factors that demonstrate the indispensability of centralized environmental planning and management, even if its implementation tends towards decentralization. So, it depends on the central government initiatives based on international agreements, combined with decentralized actions carried out by intermediate or local levels in a government in a system of vertical intergovernmental cooperation. This regime, this kind of governance, it is very complex, but is very needed. and it is possible. It's not an utopia, but it's something that is being built up in many countries for many aspects of environmental agenda. Dear students, we made a very good journey today. We went through some crucial concepts from the realm of political science. These concepts and these analytical categories enabled us to enter in the domain of environmental policy, and they represent important tools for us to analyze its characteristics. I selected 15 characteristics that give a singularity to the domain of environmental policy, and today we discussed already some of them, 5 of the 15. In the next class, we will conclude these characteristics. We will have a more familiar view of environmental policy, and we will move on to other subjects such as the principles of the environmental policy. Thank you for your presence. See you next class.